Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Making African America, a virtual symposium on immigration and the changing dynamics of Blackness. My name is Natalie Hopkinson, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Communication, Culture, and Media Studies at Howard University. And I'm really excited to be moderating this conversation about the way that journalists mediate Blackness. So today we're going to have a great panel. So I will start with reading their bios. First, we have Carl-Philippe Juste. He and his politically active family were forced to flee Haiti in 1965. And since 1991, he has been a photojournalist at the Miami Herald. He shared a Pulitzer Prize as a member of the staff. In 2016, Juste won a prestigious Night Arts Challenge grant to complete Havana, Haiti, Two Cultures, One Community, which is a book and exhibit of photographs and essays about Cubans and Haitians' lives and shared humanity. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you. Hello.
Next, we have Isma'il Kushkush. He is a journalist who has contributed to the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Smithsonian, Nation, Guernica, and other publications. He received a BA degree in History and International Relations from the University of California, Davis, and a Master of Arts degree in Journalism from Columbia Journalism School in New York. He was a fellow at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and an Ida B. Wells Fellowship recipient with Type Investigations. Welcome, Isma'il.
Thank you.
Next, we have Felice León. She is a host, producer, and multimedia journalist at The Root. She has hosted and produced many of the site's viral explainers, on-air interviews, including We Built This, Why Cap Takes a Knee, and the Black History of Memorial Day. She currently hosts and produces Unpack That, an original video series by The Root that examines various topics related to Americans' precarious relationships with race. And finally, we have Jeneé Osterheldt. She is a Boston Globe culture columnist covering identity and social justice through the lens of culture and the arts. A 2001 graduate of Norfolk State University, she previously worked at the Kansas City Star, and she was a 2017 Nieman Fellow at Harvard, where she studied the intersection of art, justice, and Black representation. So really excited to have this conversation. Of course, immigration and Black immigration to the United States is nothing new, but increasingly we're hearing increased media attentions around the very complex articulations of being Black. And so I'd like to sort of start us off by just hearing from everybody around this virtual roundtable with the personal. So the conference is really about migration and the multiple identities within the Black experience across borders, across ethnicities, languages, and so on. Can you briefly tell us what cultural identities that you personally bring to your work as a journalist? I guess we could start with Felice.
Oh, sure. So I am born and raised in New York and Queens specifically. I always have to rep my borough. I feel like that's like a New York thing. But in terms of ethnicity, so my father is Cuban, Afro-Cuban, and my mother is African-American. And these are absolutely identities that I bring with me, I carry with me in my work. And really every day in the world.
I'm born and raised in Northern Virginia, right outside of DC, the DMV area. I'm Black. My mom was white. My father is Black American. Both of them were Southern. My mother was from the mountains of North Carolina. My dad is from the projects in Northern Virginia. So to me, I bring a very Black American, what I call Southeast experience, because Northern Virginia has both the Southern influence and the East Coast influence, and the HBCU experience. So all of those things are what I bring with me to the table.
Wonderful. Isma'il.
So I was born in the state of Utah. Grew up in
mostly California. My father, my parents came from Sudan in the 70s as graduate students at the University of California. We moved around a lot. I grew up between the US, Sudan, Syria, Kuwait, back to the US. And yeah, we, identify as Sudanese, as African, as Middle Eastern, as Muslim. Just have multiple layers of identity that we work with and identify according to what setting we're in.
I guess you're waiting for me, right? I'm Haitian born. Mother is from Cuba. My father's Haitian. Was raised in a trilingual environment. Well, actually, 4 languages: Creole, French, Spanish, and English. Moved to New York in 1965. Landed in JFK and from Haiti, and lived there for about 10 years. And then my father, we moved to Miami in a caravan, actually. And when we got to Miami, my father got highly involved in the local politics, and he is known to be the father of Little Haiti. There was not a Little Haiti before my father. He coined it along with a couple of pioneers. So my identification is diverse and it's complex, but I identify myself as being Black.
Okay. Well, I was born in Canada myself, and my parents are from Guyana, and grew up in a lot of different parts. Can really relate, Jeneé, to it's so much diversity right here in the United States, and so it does. I think these are all assets that you bring into your work as a journalist. And one of the questions that I definitely wanted to talk about was the whole issue of naming. So how people name themselves, how people name others, how journalists name others, it's really loaded. We've been called Negro, African American, we talk about the lowercase Black, the uppercase Black. My father-in-law, who's from Jamaica, says that he's not Black, he's Jamaican, right? So how have you approached this question in your work of how to name people? And whoever wants to jump in.
I let people name themselves when possible. Like when possible, if, sometimes you're broadly writing, so you can't let somebody name themselves when you're broadly writing. But when I'm very specifically interviewing a person, I let them identify themselves. I tend to be a Black is Black kind of person, but if you are Haitian, Jamaican, Afro-Cuban, Afro-Latino, African, anywhere from across the diaspora, I tend to reference both identities, like Black, but also I write in Boston is 20, a lot of people don't know, but Boston is 25% Black. Of that 25%, a big old chunk is across the diaspora. Lots of Haitian representation, lots of Afro-Caribbean representation, lots and lots of Cape Verdean, and depending on where you are on the Cape Verdean scale, some of them identify as Black, some of them don't. So I try to ensure that when I identify them as Black, I also don't erase their cultural identity and wherever they came from. But I also wince when people only want to be exclusively. I know there's a thing that happens when you're not born in America and then you come here and you become Black. And I know that carries an anti-Blackness because of what it means globally to be Black. So sometimes it's hard for me. I still struggle with when people want to only be one and get offended if they are the other. And I understand why it exists because of anti-Blackness, because of white supremacy, but I also feel like there's such a strength and power in the importance of us being collectively a Black community. So it's something I always have a dialogue with my sources so that we can be in community with each other.
Yeah, like, so my mother, who's Guyanese, you know, I told my father-in-law I was going to be sharing that anecdote, and she wanted to be clear, I'm Black. And she, you know, just for the record, I'm Black. I'm very happy to be called Black. And I think you're right. It is, at the root of it, is an anti-Blackness. Felice, you were shaking your head.
Yeah,
a second ago.
so I will say, for the record, I am Black with a capital B, right? Like, let there be no ambiguity. You know, in journalism school, actually, there was a point where one of our professors, we were going through a case study. It was about identity. And, you know, he asked us, and he got to me. And it's actually sort of randomly called on me. And I was like, you know, very clear that I'm Black with a capital B. And I choose to identify myself as such because I said the slave ship made multiple stops before it, you know, got to these shores. And while I identify, and I absolutely, you know, acknowledge the Cuban side of me, but they Black too, right? Y'all Black. Y'all Black. And by all means, you know, I growing up in New York City, and the word, you know, we didn't have the language Afro-Latino, you know, at the time. And I recall, you know, things just sort of being, you know, public school, you can imagine high school, you know, there were cliques, right? So we had the Black clique, we had, you know, the Latino clique, and I actually wasn't accepted by the Latino clique, and which was really interesting to me. And those sort of this idea, this sort of anti-Blackness I've experienced, and is still really pervasive. And you know, in New York City, going to Dominican hair salons and being having the experience of, you know, being so young and having, you know, women talking about me and sort of like cowering because I'm 10 and 11 and 12, and not there with my mom, and I'm getting my hair done, and having them talk about how my hair is, you know, it's obviously bad hair, nappy hair. And, you know, one time actually having had my hair burnt off, like it literally, because they assumed that it was, you know, a specific texture, put too much heat in it. And my hair, it was close to the root and sort of turned like the color of bone and just fell to the floor, a chunk of it. And so those are traumas that I've experienced. Y'all see it's trauma. No. So, you know, these are, you know, all experiences. These experiences are real. And anti-Blackness certainly does exist. And in terms of sources, you know, as Jeneé said, it is absolutely, you know, you allow your source to, you know, identify themselves as they choose to be identified, and we absolutely respect that. And, you know, in working with the root, typically, you know, people are, actually, I'm thinking of someone who just sort of comes to mind, and, you know, he was like, he was Dominican, but he was very clear. He was like, I'm Black, you know? And I think that the beauty is now we're seeing communities sort of evolve, because during the time when my hair was on the floor in a Dominican salon, you would be hard pressed to find a Dominican person, or at least I will say personally, you know, I hadn't found many Dominican people who would just be like, I'm Black, right? But this is sort of the evolution and what we've seen with language, and how, you know, people are really evolving, and choosing to identify themselves. And don't get me wrong, there's absolutely nothing wrong with identifying as being Cuban, or, you know, as being Dominican, or any, whatever the case may be. But know that, you know, ultimately, as I said before, you know, the slave ship made multiple stops. So
absolutely. And, you know, what I was, and I, even just with the anti-Black, you know, so that we're living in an anti-Black white supremacist country world, you know, is very clear. But Isma'il, I wanted to sort of bring you into this conversation because, you know, on one level, to say you're Jamaican, you know, if you're from majority Black countries, or you come from a place on the continent, you know, the idea of being Black is not something that, say, if you're born and raised in Ghana, actually, it's not a thing, right? So you could see how somebody might feel like they identify with being Ghanaian, and this idea of Blackness is a, you know, it's something that's imposed in America. So do you, I mean, have you encountered this issue at all in your work and your experiences?
Absolutely. I mean, I want to emphasize what Jeneé and Felice said about letting your sources speak for themselves and identify in the way that they feel comfortable. And sometimes, you know, it depends on what the story is and what it emphasizes. But I mean, I think in my own personal experience, you know, when my parents first came to the U.S., and, you know, the idea of being, you know, Black, you know, in Sudan, in, you know, in their country of origin, you know, these are not the issues. You know, it's more tribal, what ethnic, what region you come from. But I mean, I remember my parents telling me, you know, in California, I was at the age of 3, I was lost, and they called the police, and you know, and when they found me, you know, the police officer, they overheard the police officer describing me using the N-word, that, you know, we found the N-word boy. And for them, that was a shock. I mean, it was the, you know, the first hit of reality of how color and race work in the U.S. But I mean, it really, you know, in my journalistic work, it really depends on what the story is. You know, but and these things, you know, when I think, say, of you know, Trump's usage of the S word describing African immigrants or African countries, and how that you know, created a reaction within, you know, various communities, or you know, the travel ban and what African countries were affected by the travel ban. You know, there's these specific identities that are useful in our work, by pinpointing you know, these places of origin, that level of identity. But then, of course, there is a greater Black and African identity and experience that is significant when discussing other issues.
Carl, I'd love to get you into this conversation as well. I mean, so, you know, we all would, you know, it's a nice idea to have this unified Blackness, this sort of solidarity, you know, across ethnicities and cultural backgrounds, languages, and et cetera. The reality is, in places like Miami, and, you know, and in New York, where you grew up, you know, there are differences. And how have you seen that play out? How have you seen those tensions play out?
Well, you know, arriving in New York City in '65, you know, I guess my first identifier was immigrant, from a predominantly Black country, and then the second identifier would be Haitian, and then the third identifier would be Black. I remember my brothers had to set up a committee to walk to work, to walk home from school, because some of the Latin and Black gangs would prey on us. And it got to the point that my brothers were able to form alliances with other immigrant groups, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans specifically in Brooklyn. And we kind of like looked out for each other. Color didn't come into play for me till probably 1969, 1970. I remember being in Midtown and being of immigrant economic status, which means holding 3 jobs and being a latchkey kid, or being raised by my siblings. I remember clearly, you know, riding with my dad in his taxi, because that's one of the jobs he did. He also worked at the Brooklyn Naval Yard, and I remember him picking up a client in Midtown, and I was sitting in the front seat, and apparently the gentleman sat down, and my dad began, you know, to start the car and move away, and the gentleman called my dad an N-word, and he stopped the car. I just felt a chill coming over this whole environment. The whole Impala turned ice. And I remember him exiting the car, looking at me with a really stern look, like, do not move. and him opening the back door and requesting that this gentleman exit the vehicle, that his money or his patronage was no longer welcomed. The gentleman was somewhat set aside, or kind of looked at him as like, who do you think you are? And I remember my dad being very, very angry to the point of trembling, in terms of he probably could have punched this guy out and did serious bodily harm. But my dad never chose the path of violence unless it was extremely warranted. So he got back in the car, he looked at me, and I wouldn't say he was teary, but his eyes was welling. He was mad. And I remember him saying, son, I don't ever want you to use that word to describe anyone else, especially people who look like you. And he said, I remember loosely him, it's the first time I remember him referencing this. He said, your crown has been paid for, wear it well. He went and put the car into drive. And from that day on, it was in my house was Nina Simone, was James Brown. It was, Langston Hughes. I mean, he just opened the floodgates to African-American thinkers and philosophers and all very different type of disciplines. Just opened the floodgates. And
I'm sorry.
to reaffirm that we have to, this identity of being Haitian has to take second seat to being Black. Even though he would say to me, hey, don't go outside without a shirt. Don't ever walk outside with a t-shirt. And if I would make the comment, well, my friends are doing it, he would says, no. In our culture, we dress when we leave our house. So it was a really crazy fine line. And then when I moved to Miami, because in Brooklyn, I was surrounded, by Latins, and I was surrounded by Caribbean immigrants. When I moved to Miami, we were one of the first Haitians on the block. There were other Haitian there, but they were the first Haitian family. And I remember walking from Shadlawn Elementary, and this white boy came up to me, and he just gave me a left hook to my eye and called me the N-word. And I chased him down, and I got on top of him. And I was so mad. And then I stopped, and I said, if I retaliate, if I show aggression, then I gave him power to that word. If I retaliate with my fists and I stomped on his face, I'm really saying, hey, that word bothered me. So I let him go and I pushed him off. And I went home, and my dad came home later that evening, and he said, what's wrong with your eye? I said, this is what happened. He said, what did you do? I said, I chased him. He said, did you beat him up? I said, no, I let him go. And he kind of sat me down and says, why? I said, because I didn't want to legitimize the word. He said, son, you're wearing your crown well. And since that day, my work is all about trying to discover and rediscover that Black space, and searching it in familiar faces and in places that I'm not comfortable with. So it may be Afro-Cuban, maybe Dominican, maybe Jamaican, or maybe African-American. Because when people looked at my mom, she was very, very, she could pass for white. Everybody in my family is lighter than me. And I used to get teased. Oh, you must have been I have great siblings, but sometimes they get mean. Oh, you must have been adopted because you're the darkest one. And and I get mad, and then it's we ain't kidding. Of course, you're a brother. But I remember walking with my mom, and people would question, why is she babysitting a Black child?
My mom has a very similar story that she tells about so diverse. But you spoke so beautifully about how that your experiences have shaped your work as a journalist. And I'm wondering if other people can share how, you know, if at all, how Black immigration has come up in your work. Are there any stories that sort of that stand out where you dealt with some of these issues about, you know, very complex Black identity and immigration? It could be Isma'il, Jeneé, Felice. How has this issue come up in stories that you've written?
Well, when I was saying earlier about Greater Boston being a quarter Black and a big bulk of that being Black immigrants. So I've worked really intentional. I've tried to be very intentional about encompassing the nuance of Blackness, which doesn't only serve the sources themselves and our readers, it serves all of us. It just serves the collective Black community for us to have this type of nuance. We saw how it played out with Kamala Harris and like the very interesting and trendy need to label her as Asian and to sort of like not want her to be a Black woman when she so clearly self-identifies as a Black woman. And I think it's important that we talk about people in all of their nuances. Like you can be Black and speak Spanish. You can be Black and speak Creole. You can be Black and also be South Asian. It doesn't mean that you are not Black. Black people can be many, many things. I think the more we show that in our storytelling, the more we show that in our sourcing, we become the fullness and richness of our multitudes. I think that for so long, the gatekeepers have been white and they have decided what Black means in America. And the story that Carl just told is kind of was my point from earlier about like people come here, Black people come here from all over the world, and they are not Black wherever they come from. They are Guyanese, they are Haitian, they are Dominican, and then they come here and they become Black. And it's often through a terrible lens of trauma. And then they have to do things like Carl's amazing dad did to kind of soothe the trauma and say, no, this is beautiful, this is rich, this is fortifying, this is Nina Simone, this is, you know, James Brown, this is all of this is Langston Hughes and James Baldwin, it's all these other beautiful things. And I think the more we tell stories, like when I tell stories of these amazing Black women who are Haitian in Boston, who are literally disrupting white supremacy here, it's important to me that people know that they are Black and they are also Haitian, or that they were born here, but their grandmother worked very hard to bring the whole family over from Haiti first. Because it's like, understand that we are many things. We carry much lineage with us. And I think this only cultivates power and creates a dialogue that shows how full we are. And we're so much more than like the very flattened characters that we've been allowed to be. And it allows us to connect in a greater way. So that's when I look at my storytelling, that's kind of how it changed. As far as my personal story, I mean, I'm pretty, you know, Black American, but as a Black woman with a white mother, there's a whole set of circumstances of feeling like anyone, like what Carl said and what you said, Natalie, like, you know, people feeling like you don't belong to your mother. And then other people being like, well, you're not really Black. You need to say you're mixed because just because of the one drop rule don't make you Black. And it's like, no, I'm Black. Like, I am very much Black. My dad is Black. I am Black. This is my life. And you're not about to police my Blackness. Like, that's not what's about to happen here. So,
and that's how you self-identify. And I think, you know, everybody on this panel has been really clear because of your lived experience of like, it's very clear we're not a monolith, we're a really complex community. And I wonder, like, has it ever been a challenge for you, because you're navigating very powerful media, you know, institutions, and has it been difficult sometimes to be able to get that across, you know, as with your editors? Isma'il, I'm wondering if you.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, I'll share two things here. There's a story that I worked on about ancient Nubian pyramids, the Smithsonian, about the significance of ancient Sudan and the Kingdom of Kush and so forth. But for me, it wasn't just a story, about specifically about that history, but it was important to put it into a greater global context, especially last year. This whole idea that Africans did not produce or were not a part of the classical world and civilization. In fact, one of the reasons for not having that understanding has to do with racism of early archaeology. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, the whole idea of trying to prove biblical stories, disconnect ancient Egypt, ancient Nubia from Africa. So I had to weave that into the story. It wasn't just about narrating, there are these pyramids in ancient Nubia, but understanding why they have not been recognized as a part of, African and Black history. And it was probably one of my most successful stories. I mean, as far as getting interviews, follow-ups, questions, etc. But also, I mean, I in addition to writing on, immigration in the U.S. and how identity and Black identity and immigration play in the U.S., I think it's also important to understand how this, comes into global reporting, international reporting. One of the reasons I got into journalism is my frustration with how African affairs have been covered by major media outlets. The very sweeping generalizations, the emphasis on stories that perpetrated, stereotypes of either Africa, of the Middle East, and when there were so many nuances and details. I mean, I remember writing one story, in Sudan with, there was a rebel attack on the capital Khartoum, and I was trying to explain to the editor, the nuances, the politics behind it all. And maybe after, 20 minutes of doing that explanation, they asked me to break it down to good guys and bad guys for an American leadership. And that's exactly why I did not, that's exactly why I got into journalism, against that idea of oversimplification. We bring to these stories a deeper understanding, our language skills, our cultural skills, in order to tell stories in a better way beyond oversimplified narratives that are clickbaits and are meant for commercial purposes. And I think that's the importance of having diverse newsrooms, but also intelligent storytelling.
I think it's funny because when I left UM and started my job at the Herald back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, there was this diversity push in newsrooms, getting all these different voices, and which I thought was great. But I think I'll speak for myself as a Black journalist, and I have to operate in multiple spaces. I have to operate in a cultural space, because South Florida has, I think, 72 different languages are spoken within the school system, something crazy like that. And I have to operate in a race space, because before the cop can hear my patois, or even if my broken Spanish, he sees the color of my skin. And then I have to operate in a space of multi, I guess multilism or multidimensionalism, where people who are like me may be Jamaican Cubans, or maybe Haitian Dominicans, and you have to navigate that space, and you learn to adapt, because if, specifically when it comes to immigration, something so clear is race-based. You know, Cubans wash ashore in Miami Beach. They get a wet foot, dry foot policy. Haitians wash ashore. They are automatically detained, and the first course of action is repatriation. And this policy went on until Obama came around. And you would run into my Cuban brothers and sisters, and they took pride in the progress they made. And, you know, I would remind them that, you know, maybe they were not 10 feet away from the finishing line, but they were way ahead of me because of their nationality, and because of their whiteness, or because of their ability to get this wet foot, dry foot status. So it puts you in front of a lot of other people, a lot of other immigrants. And, you know, my dad said, you can't blame them. The system was devised for them to have a certain gain. What we need to do as Haitians is to use those rules and make it applicable to Haitian migrants. And that's what he did. He fought for new arrivals, new Haitian arrivals, to have access to public schools, to have access to social services. And because of that, he was celebrated, because he was operating in the mindset of Toussaint Louverture. He was operating in Nat Turner, operating in the term of being a freedom fighter, even in a country which every day, every morning, praises itself, put their hands on their heart and pledge allegiance to freedom and liberty. And having to operate with that type of contradiction is hard for Black folks. I don't care where you come from.
I mean, I think this is something that for so many of us on the panel, you know, have worked for, you know, white dominant institution. And Felice, I want to get you back in, because you're coming from the root. And so I wonder how you can, if you could just sort of share what that experience is, and whether you think, you know, is the root focused more on the African, do you think it's more centered on the African-American experience? Is it, you know, do you feel like it's, as far as what the readership is it a global Blackness that you're experiencing on the root?
That's a great question. I think that we focus, in terms of our coverage, it has been very focused on the African-American experience, but I think that what, you know, everyone really, I guess, a theme that we're seeing here in this conversation is obviously people bring their identities with them. And so as we've had, you know, folks who are, for example, one of my colleagues, I could think of one of my colleagues on the video team is Haitian, Jessica Louis. And then my other colleague on the video team, he's Jamaican, and PJ Ricketts. So, and we have various people who are, you know, of the diaspora, and they bring those experiences into their stories, and we tend to have, I would say, really a blessing is being there is, you know, we're pitching a story, and it's and we have really, especially specifically in video, we have the flexibility. We have a team that we work with to be able to get these stories up and out. But, you know, the editors, the root is run, so our editor-in-chief, Danielle Belton, is run by Black women. I would say like the 3 highest in command at the root are Black women. And they are all very, obviously, I think we know, I mean, this has now become this phrase is so overused, but you know, we all know that Black people are not a monolith and that we have these very different experiences. And I do think that when given the opportunity, we absolutely, you know, share a bit of who we are and use that in the stories that we choose to write. And even like feature pieces, you know, if it's not something that's specifically local or specifically a news piece that we would have to cover, something that we have a little bit more time for, absolutely, you know, we do bring that, I would say a bit of that scope. But yes, to answer your question, it has previously been, I would say, sort of focused on the African-American experience, but we all are able to, we've sort of done that based on our experiences.
I'm
so jealous.
Listen, you should, like, our newsroom is popping. No, I'm just joking.
No, I mean, like, I've never had a Black editor. I've been a journalist for 18 years. I have never had a Black editor. I've never even sat next to a Black colleague in my entire career. I mean, obviously, I have close Black colleague friends, and we find each other in the newsroom just the way we found each other in cafeterias at school. But every time I think about places like The Root and Undefeated and just, you know, Essence, places that are just inherently for us, by us, I always get a little like, happy, but also just like, dang, because that's not my experience in journalism. And it's, I've had incredibly supportive editors, but it is exhausting to always kind of have to explain.
right.
You know, to
well,
explain.
and I actually, Jeneé, I wanted to ask you just to follow up on that, because, you know, Isma'il had that incredible on the nose comment. I need you to tell me it's good guys and Black guys. I mean, I'm sorry, good guys and bad guys. And I mean, have you had similar, like, I mean, could you just talk broadly about, you know, maybe some of the like ways you've had to educate your editors, you know, on certain stories? Can you think of some examples of the way?
I've had incredibly supportive editors, but it's also, it's not, the thing is, in a newsroom, it's not just your editor you're dealing with your colleagues, you're dealing with people who look at you as the Black writer. So people who on their beat should be covering Black people as part of their beat. If you're the business writer, there's Black businesses. If you are the health writer, Black people are health experts. They get sick, they get, you know, it's all of these things. And on their beat, when the Black story comes up, they email it to you. And it's like, bruh, like, you become sort of like the voice. And it's like, I'm one Black person, like, and to all of our points today, we are such a nuanced people. You can't count on the 4 Black people in the room to be the Black community. And so it's not just like the having to pitch stories differently and do so much pre-reportage to support your pitch. It's the dealing with the ignorance that comes with having an industry. And I don't even mean this to any one newsroom. The journalistic industry is so white, so not working class. And it's a very specific, powerful, privileged lens that they like to pretend progressive. Oh, I would have voted for Obama a 3rd time, while also not respecting the nuance of Blackness. I did this series for Black History Month. Well, it wasn't just for Black. I've been doing a series since the lynching of George Floyd called A Beautiful Resistance. So it's been going on for several months. As part of that, I launched an Instagram page where I feature all kinds of Black people from all over the diaspora sharing their life as a beautiful resistance. For Black History Month, I specifically made a choice to include all types of Black immigrant voices because Black history is theirs too. So I have someone like Worcester is the biggest Guyanese population in all of America. So I have someone from Worcester that's like, hey, you know, my name is George and my life is a beautiful resistance because, and for Black History Month, I'm honoring the Guyanese population because. And I wanted those types of stories to be part of it because I'm like, this is Black America too.
Again, the thing is, it's like, you know, our history is their history. Racism hurts the oppressor and the oppressed. And what people don't seem to understand, well, economy is driving us to diversity just because based on need, because they could see growth in certain communities that they cannot get in others. Good case in point, Black History came up, and by the way, we have our first leadership in our newsroom, Monica Richardson out of Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and she is the first Black executive manager of our paper since its inception. And not to say a lot of the great full-time employees we had, FTEs, reporters and journalists of color, has soon left, and there's just a couple of us left, maybe 3 or 4. But also the newsroom has shrunk. I say this because we have to find vehicles in retelling our narratives from the various different nuances that may exist. Case in point, for Black History Month, I took 28 different people from all aspects from all professions and asked them to define their Blackness. 28. We're talking about straight, transgender, we're talking about Cuban, Haitian, and really try to reiterate that we operate, what we share in common is not, our Blackness is not solely defined in terms of slavery and persecution, but our Blackness is defined in resiliency and resolving the condition that we might be in. And it was beautiful because I was learning things, and I was seeing these point of views and these personal stories. There was one woman who's a transgender was equating her life, her being beaten up because she felt as a young age that she was in the wrong body, and her being physically, beaten almost to death because she knew she was a woman, even though she was trapped in this male body. And she equate that to some of our Black heroes, and she said, I am willing to take on this because of them, because what they went through, what they persevered, what they decided, the space that they decided to claim, and what I'm going through is nothing compared to the path that they had set before me. And that one interview got more hits than anybody else, from doctors to scientists. It really hit a chord, and it hit a chord because being Black is not a struggle. Being Black is beautiful. It really is. I never framed it in terms of being less of. And that's because I can look around, and I could go to Iraq and find Black people. I could go to Jordan and find Black people. Brazil, which is the highest concentration of Black folks outside of Nigeria. And that is to me is a testament that our color, that our culture has traveled.
Absolutely. And actually, I wanted to ask you all about, this sort of idea of a global Blackness and these shared experiences, and how technology may be facilitating, that. I know I was struck. I was in the UK a few years ago interviewing some millennials, and I was amazed at how they talked about, oh gosh, what are we going to do about Trump? And oh, did you watch? And they would talk about Black Twitter, and they knew prominent people in Black Twitter, and they were just like right in the conversation. I'm like, and they, they use the us and we, and I'm like, but you live here. So, so, you know, I wanted to see if you guys, you know, had any sort of thoughts about like these global moments. You know, I was thinking about the Oprah interview, you know, where I know I was live tweeting it with people all over the world, and wanted to see what you think about technology and social media sort of bringing, how that's impacting, you know, us as a global Black community.
Well, I would say that, oh, did you know that?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Felice.
Rock, paper, scissors, say? No, I'm just so yeah, I would absolutely agree. So I did, well, actually you were asking about sort of the influence of social media and the internet, and Black Twitter, you know, is Twitter, right? And I've had the opportunity to actually study and do a piece on it. And the connection that we've had through the joy and the pain, right? So through seeing, you know, the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and of course Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade, and though not actually seeing, well, first of all, we're not even going to talk about the trauma piece, but I'm saying experiencing their deaths together. Let me be clear what I mean by seeing. So we're experiencing, you know, this together and grieving together online, and supporting each other together online, and also, you know, on the flip side, you know, uplifting each other, you know, through it. So we have absolutely through even, you know, through the pandemic and having to be home specifically, and spending much of our time online, I would absolutely say that this has connected us in many, many ways. You know, we talked about you mentioned the UK. You know, you saw the activism also in the UK. I know everybody saw that viral John Boyega speech, and that was in last June. He was going in, and he was about to cry, and we were watching, about to cry with him, right? And this is because it was, you know, all, you know, shared virtually. It was all shared online. We share moments of Black joy together as well, right? So, you know, the whatever challenge we're doing, and they're not just doing it, you know, in the US, you know, be it, and obviously that goes into TikTok, and we'll leave TikTok out of the equation because parts
On TikTok,
Right.
and let's not, like, we have to acknowledge that parts of TikTok like absolutely problematic, but so we're gonna leave that alone. But
parts of all social media are problematic.
Thank you.
For the very exact reason TikTok is.
Exactly. No. Thank you, sister. But yes, I'm sorry too. Just ultimately, it has had a way to absolutely bring us together, to have a shared experience, to grieve together, to experience joy together, grieve together. I remember, my goodness, when Chadwick Boseman died, like that was a crazy evening, a crazy day. But yes, absolutely. Through social media, we are connected, and I would say that bond is almost strengthened.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could also add in to just share a little bit of, you know, even just about your reporting on the continent.
Sure. I mean, as you said, that, you know, technology definitely has played an incredible role in bringing people together. But I mean, it really has to be said that the Black American experience is felt globally. You know, I was in Sweden 5 years ago and wrote a story for the New York Times about the first Afro-Swedish rendition of A Raisin in the Sun. The first time it was in the Swedish language. It was it was by actors who are descended of African immigrants or adoptees or mixed marriages. And you know, I was discussing with them, how did they come to this, this play, and they spoke to me about Malcolm X, about Martin Luther King, about the impact of hip hop. This is in Sweden, at the height of the immigration or the refugee crisis in 2015, and where you have refugees from different parts of Africa, especially from East Africa, and the racism that they experienced in Sweden, and the impact, the cultural production of the United States, of Black America. So I mean, that has to be recognized. You know, that this has become global. Just in this past year, in 2020, with you know, after the murder of George Floyd, I think I've been on at least 5 or 7 different platforms discussing Blackness in the Middle East and North Africa. You know, I tell, you know, I've told people that, you know, what used to be private discussions, for the first time in my life, that these are public discussions about issues that we've been talking about, you know, privately for years. I mean, I'll just add one last thing that, you know, that I think exemplifies this is, you know, if you go back to 2018 with the World Cup final, with France winning the World Cup, a team made of mostly African immigrants from Mali, from Guinea. You had, you know, a global African support. It didn't really matter what, you know, if your country was, you know, your origin was represented in the French team. People supported France because it was a team of immigrants, mostly of Black immigrants. And it just shows you how this has become a global matter. So it's global. I mean, I think we are in the new era now, where the global African Black experience is you know, telling its story.
Great. Jeneé?
I think Felice so beautifully kind of encompassed what social media does for us and how it's a great connector, especially for collective grief, but also for joy. And one of the most beautiful things about social media for me has been not only our ability to find laughter in the struggle and find that joy in the struggle, or what Ossie Davis would call that secret cup of gladness that comes with being Black, is just the democratization of voice, and having that power of us being the storytellers, us doing language. You know, they used to say the way we talked was ignorant. Now they talk like us. And TikTok, but Twitter too. Like, I mean, when Go Off was trending in the top 10 and it was in reference to Taylor Swift, like, how? Yes, how? But the power in that, to kind of what Isma'il was saying, is the Black identity has become global, particularly how Black Americans express themselves and how people who are Black in America express themselves. The culture is global. And I think this allows us to redefine citizenship and divorce it from whiteness. It's why it was so important for me to call Kamala a Black woman. It doesn't erase her mother. It doesn't erase her South Asian-ness. It's why she calls herself a Black woman while still celebrating her mother and her roots. But when you are able to see her and call her Black, or see Lala Vasquez and call her Black, you're able to have new conversations on citizenship. And I think social media has allowed us to kind of show the nuance of our Blackness and show citizenship is not white. Citizenship is not flat. And that's what is so important to me about all of these hashtags and conversations we're having, is that through sharing our nuances, we have slowly, we're not there yet, but we are slowly starting to divorce the identity of what it means to look American, be a citizen.
Okay.
Jeneé.
Well, we should probably go to the audience questions now. And so the first question is Patricia Collins from the audience asks, can the panelists provide examples from their own experiences as journalists of how diverse forms of Blackness influence the coverage of Black issues, both positively and negatively in the news? And Carl, I think, you know, specifically, if you could talk about the images too, you know, and positive, and if you could, that question in terms of like the kind of imagery you're producing as a photographer would be great.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, when I cover events like Basel or Food and Wine or Black Lives Matter, I always try to cover it with the lens of trying to speak power to truth, truth to power. And what I mean by that is that to make sure to put in my images people who look like me in the conversation. When I work on personal projects, like for instance, I just finished doing a project on the Parkland shooting with Bloomberg, or if I'm doing a project for the Herald, like I said before, my Blackness. It's really important to approach it in a way that it is a time to learn about oneself. It's a moment of discovery. I do not profess to be an expert in being Black, because the act of being Black is built on nuances, is leveled, it's saturated in a way. So I always approach my work in terms of being a pupil as opposed to being a teacher. So having said that, I'm doing a story now about a program that's helping former Section 8 residents that been relocated, and helping them to try to engage with the broader community. And one of the candidates, she was living in Boca Raton, and I said, we have to go see her house. And she requested that we meet at a park, and I said fine. So I went to the park. I told her this plain simple, that this story is about your relocation, and your relocation is not in this park. The reason she had pushed back on going to her home, because she was in a beautiful gated community, and she didn't want her neighbors to know that she was Section 8 in a predominantly white community. So I assured her, I said, okay, look, I'm not going to give an address. I'm not going to shoot outside your house. So I used elements of her swimming pool. I mean, imagine coming from pork and beans projects and having your own private pool with manicured landscape and a beautiful canal in the backyard. And I knew that I could speak to her new reality by just hinting at her location, and that we can come to an agreement that this is important, because this is a choice she made. She wanted a better life for her kids, and she didn't feel like she was not where she came from. She was not given the services that she felt that all people required, and she made a constant choice to move out of her community in order to assure that her children can go to a good school and have access to these things which were not available to her in the projects. Now she lucked out.
Right. And so your image of it, it's sort of, challenging stereotypes about what you're talking about, who are right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, people assume that people come from low economic status are dumb. And in my experience, it's been actually the opposite. They're some of the smartest people on this planet, because they constantly have to engage a world which sees them as a deficit.
Right. And so I think, the big part of this question is looking at, so the questions about how you approach diverse forms of Blackness and how they influence your coverage of Blackness. Positively and negatively. So I'm wondering if there are other examples. So that's a really great example. I wonder if there are other examples for other panelists of, how you deal with the positive, negative, that spectrum in your work.
So I cover social justice and identity. So I center Blackness and otherized peoples, period. And for a long time, just because of the nature of our country and white supremacy, so much of that deals with traumas and oppression. So it doesn't mean the people that I'm writing about are negative, but sometimes the tone is. And for me, that work is important work. But what I realized, and especially because I'm a columnist now and I've been in the game longer, that I have a different type of power than I ever had before. And when George Floyd was lynched, I said, not only was I was at his funeral and I was just exhausted. And all I kept thinking is I've been writing stories like this for most of my career now. And when I got back to Boston, I told my editor, I want to create a series that celebrates Black life while we're here, while we're alive, in our fullness. And I don't want the people to have to be Black excellence or have to be elite or rich or any. I just want to celebrate beautiful Black people living their best lives, and their beautiful resistance is whatever it means to them. And that's how I started A Beautiful Resistance. And that's my answer to like countering negative imagery. Like I'm always going to have to do social justice stories, and they're always going to be kind of about, you know, fighting supremacy. But I also have created a space for just positive, for creating balance so that we are full. You know, white people have stories on how they are gardening and winning farmers markets and all this stuff. We get to have that too.
Yeah.
And how has that been? What kind of? I'm curious about what kind of response you've gotten to that.
It's been crazy because people all over the country have been watching the videos and reading the stories and engaging on social media, and it showed me what a thirst there is for that type of balance. Because people who weren't even checking for Black stories in the globe, people from Chicago, people from Texas, have been reaching out about these stories. And it's because I think we just don't see stories about Black people being happy that aren't told through the lens of elitism or wealth or the Ivies. And, you know, people were like, oh, are you going to really do this series during one of the darkest times of our modern lives? Like there's the pandemic, there's, you know, the so-called racial reckoning, which I don't like to call it that because reckoning means we are accounting for and we're not there yet. But I'm like, this is when we need it, because we're only telling things through the lens of oppression and sadness. We are disempowering ourselves because someone else, I think Carl said, it's like, we are not, Black is not a burden. Like we're not a burden. This is like beautiful. We are beautiful people. So I try to bring that to my story to kind of show, like, frame things through the joy.
Yeah.
And I think, please go ahead.
As I'm covering, I'm trying to show the diversity of experiences. We're not just crying, we're laughing, we're engaging, we're curious. One of the things when I did the Blackness, my Blackness is project, is that I was adamant that all the portraits, all 28, one for each day, had to be all in the same space. And I did that for that same reason, to show the diversity and the nuances that we come from different, though we are all Black, we bring different treasures to our, and different textures to our lives. We bring different things, and what we keep and what we discard should be on us. It shouldn't be on somebody else. If I decide to straighten up my hair, it's because I decided to straighten up my hair, not because I saw it on television and they told me that my dreadlocks were kinky, had no value. And this sense of empowerment is extremely important because we need to be controlling our narratives. We need to continue to retell our stories. I don't need someone to give me voice because I already have a damn voice. Just pass me the mic.
And that's, you know, what journalists have been doing. And, you know, I think, you know, some of it is the nature of news. It's pretty negative, right? If it bleeds, it leads, conflict sells, but it's clickbait. And so it becomes hard to sort of frame things in a positive way. Felice, you were going to add something.
Yeah, I was. So I think that what's important to note here, and so obviously as journalists, we have power. And I remember one of my pieces, so I was working specifically about essentially the Black history of Memorial Day. And one of the scholars who I spoke with is Professor Blight, who's out at Yale. He was saying that, ultimately the sentiment was, to the victor, like essentially the winners get to tell history. And so I think that a large part of our history and our accomplishments and contributions have to this country, this very country, have been left out of history. And that is I think that sort of bringing that back and tying that in and showing that, either be it historical, so the fact that Black people were the first ones to celebrate and to acknowledge Memorial Day, or, something in a more contemporary sense. We have to sort of really insert that back into the conversation, into these narratives, so that people understand that beyond just Black History Month, beyond a designated time, just to celebrate Black people, and to really, I'll just leave it there. But I do think that this is an important part of the work as well.
Absolutely. And that's the work that you're doing, is being the narrators, being the tellers, giving that first draft of history. So we have about 4 minutes left. And so I wondered if the panel, each have about a minute, if you could share just some sort of closing thoughts about, maybe the way that, closing thoughts of your choice. But I'm very interested in hearing about how you think Black identities and diverse Black identities will shape your work in the future. So Isma'il, we haven't heard from you, so we'll let you start.
Sure. No, I mean, there's an expanding idea of what it means to be Black because of immigration, and I think that brings a richer pool of stories to look at. I mean, I lived in Harlem, and you walk down 116th Street, Little Senegal, and there's just there's so many stories to tell. So there's this expanding concept of what it is to be Black, and it's worth looking and searching for these stories. I just want to bring one thing about global reporting, because I think this is also something that's important in how what stories do we look for when we're covering Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, African diaspora in Europe. Is to be conscious of that, what the challenges to reporting are, not only domestically here because of immigration, but also in how we cover global stories, and bringing in that understanding is key to better stories.
Great. So we have about 2 minutes left. So each of the rest, you guys have about 30 minutes. What's next for you? I mean, I'm sorry, 30 seconds. What's next for you? Yeah.
For me, it's to continue to do the work I'm doing with A Beautiful Resistance, and just celebrating who we are 365, 366 on leap year. And my last words would be just to remember, as Black people of the diaspora, no matter where we're from, we belong to each other. And telling that full story and recognizing each other's nuances is only going to serve us. Our division, the cost of our division, is paying the people in power.
Great. Carl, 30 seconds.
Well, I continue to be a strong contributor to my newsroom. I keep pushing the fact of not being only treated as equal, but also having equity in the newsroom. I do personal projects. What I cannot get in the 60 hours a week, I'll use the remainder of my time on this planet to do the projects that I hold dear. So.
Beautiful. Felice, you get the last word.
My 30 seconds. So it is an absolute pleasure and an honor to be able to tell the stories that I tell. So as a Black woman in America, I understand that, a lot of the reasons why we see sort of these issues, not a lot of it, there is a why behind, much of these issues that we see today, right? So you see the ghetto, you know, was that, oh, you know, why are we exploring that? One of my colleagues explored that. Or, you know, we look at redlining, you know, this, we're seeing the impact that's still, excuse me, the impact of a policy that is really haunted us. So all that's to say that it is, again, really a matter of being about, you know, being about that life, you know, and living it and continuing to tell these stories for those who are unable to tell the stories for themselves.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. This has been the Mediating Blackness, a journalist roundtable. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.